Today we have some more actual history from the early days of our American Republic. We will be reading about a woman's capture by Indians in Butler County, Pennsylvania in 1792. Massy Harbison's husband was one of the survivors of the worst attack by Indians against the U.S. Army ever, when General St. Clair was defeated in November of 1791. Just about 6 months later, in May of 1792, Massy Harbison's house would be attacked by a large group of Indians, and she would endure a captivity worse than death. We will be reading from this book, a narrative of the sufferings of Massy Harbison from Indian Barbarity, published by Massy Harbison all the way back in 1825. Massy Harbison had given a shorter account of her capture and escape after just returning home in 1792. But after her husband died in 1822, she decided to write this book, partly as a way for a poor widow to make some money. So here is chapter 4 of her book, titled Captivity, Murder of My Children, and Escape. Vicissitude is the characteristic feature of the present life. All are the subjects in a greater or less degree of the trials and the changes of life. But although it is certain that there is a general allotment of trials in the present world, so that every heart knoweth its own bitterness, yet it is but too evident that there are some of the human family who are called to pass through those which are infinitely more severe than others. Some seem to pass over the season of life without encountering those awfully agitating billows which threaten their immediate destruction, while to others the passage to the tomb is fraught with awful tempests and overwhelming billows. Happy will it be for those who, after having sailed over the boisterous ocean of time, shall eventually be wafted by a divine breeze into the haven of eternal repose, that those trials which are of a particular nature, and of an almost overwhelming magnitude were endured by me, will appear by a recital of those sober facts, facts which are too notorious to be denied, and too peculiar to be counterfeited, to which the attention of the reader is now invited. On the return of my husband from General St. Clair's defeat, mentioned in the preceding chapter, and on his recovery from the wound he received in the battle, he was made a spy, and ordered to the woods on duty, about the 22nd of March, 1792. The appointment of spies to watch the movement of the savages was so consonant with the desires and interests of the inhabitants, that the frontiers now resumed the appearance of quiet and confidence. Those who had for nearly a year been huddled together in the blockhouse were scattered to their own habitations, and began the cultivation of their farms. The spies saw nothing to alarm them or to induce them to apprehend danger. Till the fatal morning of my captivity, they repeatedly came to our house to receive refreshments, and to lodge. On the 15th of May, my husband, with Captain Guthrie and other spies, came home about dark, and wanted supper, to procure which I requested one of the spies to accompany me to the spring and spring house, and William Maxwell complied with my request. While he was at the spring and spring house, we both distinctly heard a sound, like the bleating of a lamb or fawn. This greatly alarmed us and induced us to make a hasty retreat into the house. Whether this was an Indian decoy or a warning of what I was to pass through, I am unable to determine, but from this time and circumstance I became considerably alarmed, and entreated my husband to remove me to some secure place from Indian cruelties. But Providence had designed that I should become a victim to their rage, and that mercy should be made manifest in my deliverance. On the night of the 21st of May, two of the spies, Mr. James Davis and Mr. Sutton, came to lodge at our house, and on the morning of the 22nd at daybreak, when the horn blew at the blockhouse, which was within sight of our house, and distant about 200 yards, the two men got up and went out. I was also awake and saw the door open, and thought when I was taken prisoner that the scouts had left it open. I intended to rise immediately, but having a child at my breast, and it being awakened, I lay with it at the breast to get it to sleep again, and accidentally fell asleep myself. The spies have since informed me that they returned to the house again, and found that I was sleeping, and that they softly fastened the door and went immediately to the blockhouse. And those who examined the house after the scene was over say that both doors had the appearance of being broken open. The first thing I knew from falling asleep was the Indians pulling me out of the bed by my feet. I then looked up and saw the house full of Indians, every one of them his gun in his left hand and tomahawk in the right. Beholding the dangerous situation in which I was in, I immediately jumped to the floor on my feet, with the young child in my arms. I then took a petticoat to put on, having only the one in which I slept, but the Indians took it from me, and as much as I attempted to put it on, they attempted in taking it from me, so that I had to go just as I had been in bed. While I was struggling with some of the savages for clothing, others of them went and took the 2 eldest children out of another bed, and immediately took the 2 feather beds to the door and emptied them. The savages immediately began their work of plunder and devastation. What they were unable to carry with them they destroyed. While they were at their work, I made to the door and succeeded in getting out with one child in my arms, and another by my side. But the other little boy was so much displeased by being so early disturbed in the morning, that he would not come to the door. When I got out I saw Mr. Wolf, one of the soldiers, going to the spring for water, and beheld 2 or 3 of the savages attempting to get between him and the blockhouse. But Mr. Wolf was unconscious of his danger, for the savages had not yet been discovered. I then gave a terrific scream, by which means Mr. Wolf discovered his danger, and started to run for the blockhouse. 7 or 8 of the Indians fired at him, but the only injury he received was a bullet in his arm, which broke it. He succeeded in making his escape to the blockhouse. When I gave the alarm, one of the Indians came up to me with his tomahawk, as though about to take my life. A second came and placed his hand before my mouth, and told me to hush. Then a third came with a lifted tomahawk and attempted to give me a blow. But the first that came raised his tomahawk and averted the blow, and claimed me as his squaw. The commissary with his waiter slept in the storehouse near the blockhouse, and upon hearing the report of the guns, came to the door to see what was the matter, and beholding the danger he was in, made his escape to the blockhouse, but not without being discovered by the Indians, several of whom fired at him, and one of the bullets went through his handkerchief which was tied about his head, and took off some of his hair. The handkerchief, with several bullet holes in it, he afterwards gave to me. The waiter, on coming to the door, was met by the Indians, who fired upon him, and he received 2 bullets through his body, and fell dead by the door. The savages then set up one of their tremendous and terrifying yells, and pushed forward and attempted to scalp the man they had killed. But they were prevented from executing their diabolical purpose by the heavy fire which was kept up through the portholes from the blockhouse. In this scene of horror and alarm, I began to meditate an escape, and for this purpose attempted to direct the attention of the Indians from me, and to fix it on the blockhouse, and thought if I could succeed in this, I would retreat to a subterranean rock, with which I was acquainted, which was in the run near where we were. For this purpose I began to converse with some of those who were near me, and they began to question me respecting the strength of the blockhouse, the number of men in it, etc. And being informed that there were 40 men there, and that they were excellent marksmen, they immediately came to the determination to retreat. And for this purpose they ran to those who were besieging the blockhouse, and brought them away. They then began to flog me with their whipping sticks, and to order me along. Thus what I intended as the means of my escape was the means of accelerating my departure in the hands of the savages. But it was no doubt so ordered by a kind providence, for the preservation of the fort and the inhabitants in it. For when the savages gave up their attack and retreated, some of the men in the house had the last load of ammunition in their guns, and there was no possibility of procuring more, for it was all fastened up in the storehouse which was inaccessible. The Indians, when they had flogged me away along with them, took my oldest boy, a lad about 5 years of age, along with them, for he was still at the door by my side. My middle little boy, who was about 3 years of age, had by this time obtained a situation by the fire in the house, and was crying bitterly to me not to go, and making little complaints of the depredations of the savages. But these monsters were not willing to let the child remain behind them. They took him by the hand to drag him along with them, but he was so very unwilling to go, and made such a noise by crying, that they took him up by the feet and dashed his brains out against the threshold of the door. They then scalped and stabbed him and left him for dead. When I witnessed this inhuman butchery of my own child, I gave a most indescribable and terrific scream, and felt a dimness come over my eyes, next to blindness, and my senses were nearly gone. The savages then gave me a blow across my head and face, and brought me to my sight and recollection again. During the whole of this agonizing scene, I kept my infant in my arms. As soon as their murder was effected, they marched me along the top of the bank about 40 or 60 rods, and there they stopped and divided the plunder which they had taken from our house. And here I counted their number, and found them to be 32, 2 of whom were white men painted as the Indians. Several of the Indians could speak English well. I knew several of them very well, having seen them go up and down the Allegheny River. I knew 2 of them to be from the Seneca tribe of Indians, and 2 of them to be Munsees, for they had called at the shop to get their guns repaired, and I saw them there. We went from this place about 40 rods, and they then caught my Uncle John Curry's horses, and 2 of them, into whose custody I was put, started with me on the horses toward the mouth of the Kiskiminitas, and the rest of them went off towards Puckety. When they came to the bank that descended towards the Allegheny, the bank was so very steep, and there appeared so much danger in descending it on horseback, that I threw myself off the horse in opposition to the will and command of the savages. My horse descended without falling, but the one on which the Indian rode, who had my little boy, in descending fell and rolled over repeatedly, and my little boy fell back over the horse, but was not materially injured. He was taken up by one of the Indians, and we got to the bank of the river, where they had secreted some bark canoes under the rocks opposite to the island that lies between the Kiskiminitas and Buffalo. They attempted in vain to make the horses take the river. After trying for some time to effect this, they left the horses behind them, and took us in one of the canoes, to the point of the island, and there they left the canoe. Here I beheld another hard scene, for as soon as we landed, my little boy, who was still mourning and lamenting about his little brother, and who complained that he was injured by the fall in descending the bank, was murdered. One of the Indians ordered me along, probably that I should not see the horrid deed about to be perpetrated. The other then took his tomahawk from his side, and with this instrument of death, killed and scalped him. When I beheld this scene of inhuman butchery, I fell to the ground senseless, and with my infant in my arms, and it being under, and its little hands in the hair of my head. How long I remained in this state of insensibility I know not. The first thing I remember was my raising my head from the ground, and my feeling myself exceedingly overcome with sleep. I cast my eyes around and saw the scalp of my dear little boy, fresh bleeding from his head, in the hand of one of the savages, and sunk down to the earth again, upon my infant child. The first thing I remember after witnessing this spectacle of woe was the severe blows I was receiving from the hands of the savages, though at that time I was unconscious of the injury I was sustaining. After a severe castigation, they assisted me in getting up, and supported me when up. Here I cannot help contemplating the peculiar interposition of divine providence on my behalf. How easily might they have murdered me! What a wonder their cruelty did not lead them to effect it! But instead of this, the scalp of my boy was hid from my view, and in order to bring me to my senses again, they took me back to the river, and led me in knee-deep. This had its intended effect, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. We now proceeded on our journey by crossing the islands, and came to a shallow place where we could wade out, and so arrived to the Indian side of the country. Here they pushed me in the river before them, and had to conduct me through it. The water was up to my breast, but I suspended my child above the water, and through the assistance of the savages got safely out. From thence we rapidly proceeded forward, and came to Big Buffalo. Here the stream was very rapid, and the Indians had again to assist me. When we had crossed this creek, we made a straight course to the Conquenessing Creek, the very place where Butler now stands, and from thence we traveled on 5 or 6 miles to Little Buffalo, and crossed it at the very place where Mr. B. Sarber's mill now stands, and ascended the hill. I now felt very weary of my life, and had a full determination to make the savages kill me, thinking that death would be exceedingly welcome, when compared with the fatigue, cruelties, and miseries I had the prospect of enduring. To have my purpose effected, I stood still, one of the savages being before me, and the other walking on behind me, and I took off from my shoulder a large powder horn they made me carry. In addition to my child, who is 1 year and 4 days old, I threw the horn on the ground, closed my eyes, and expected every moment to feel the deadly tomahawk. But to my surprise, the Indians took it up, cursed me bitterly, and put it on my shoulder again. I took it off the second time and threw it to the ground, and again closed my eyes, with the assurance that I should meet death. But instead of this, the savages again took up the horn, and with an indignant, frightful countenance, came and placed it on again. I took it off the third time, and was determined to effect it then, and therefore threw it as far as I was able to from me over the rocks. The savage immediately went after it, while the other who had claimed me as his squaw, and who stood and witnessed the transaction, came up to me and said, "Well done, I did right and was a good squaw, and that the other was a lazy son of a bitch. He might carry it himself." I cannot now sufficiently admire the indulgent care of a gracious God, that at this moment preserved me amidst so many temptations, from the tomahawk and scalping knife. The savages now changed their position, and the one who claimed me as his squaw went behind. This movement, I believe, was to prevent the other from doing me any injury, and we went on till we struck the Conquenessing, at the Salt Lick, about 2 miles above Butler, where there was an Indian camp where we arrived a little before dark, having no refreshment during the day. The camp was made of stakes driven in the ground sloping, and covered with chestnut bark, and appeared sufficiently long for 50 men. The camp appeared to have been occupied some time. It was very much beaten, and large beaten paths went out from it in different directions. That night they took me about 300 yards from the camp, up a run, into a large dark bottom, where they cut the brush in a thicket, and placed a blanket on the grounds, and permitted me to sit down with my child. They then pinioned my arms back, and left my hands only with a little liberty, so that it was with difficulty that I managed my child. Here in this dreary situation, without fire or refreshment, having an infant to take care of, and my arms bound behind me, and having a savage on each side of me, who had killed 2 of my dear children that day, I had to pass the first night of my captivity. Ye mothers who have never lost a child by an inhuman savage, or endured the almost indescribable misery here related, may nevertheless think a little, though it be but little, what I endured. And hence now you are enjoying the sweet repose and the comforts of a peaceful and well-replenished habitation. Sympathize with me a little as one who is a pioneer in the work of cultivation and civilization. But the trials and dangers of the day I had passed had so completely exhausted nature, that notwithstanding my unpleasant situation, and my determination to escape if possible, I insensibly fell asleep, and repeatedly dreamed of my escape and safe arrival in Pittsburgh, and several things relating to the town, of which I knew nothing at the time, but found to be true when I arrived there. The first night passed away, and I found no means of escape, for the savages kept watch the whole of the night without any sleep. In the morning one of them left us to watch the trail or path we had come, to see if any white people were pursuing us. During the absence of the Indian, who was the one that claimed me, the savage who remained with me, and who is the murderer of my last boy, took from his bosom his scalp, and prepared a hoop, and stretched the scalp on it. Those mothers who have not seen the like done by one of the scalps of their own children, and few if any ever had so much misery to endure, will be able to form but faint ideas of the feelings which then harrowed up my soul. I meditated revenge. While he was in the very act, I attempted to take his tomahawk, which hung by his side and rested on the ground, and had nearly succeeded, and was, as I thought, about to give the fatal blow, when alas I was detected. The savage felt me at his tomahawk handle, turned around upon me, cursed me, and told me I was a Yankee, thus intimating he understood my intention, and to prevent me from doing so again, he faced me. My excuse to him for handling his tomahawk was that my child wanted to play with the handle of it. Here again I wondered at my merciful preservation, for the looks of the Indian were terrific in the extreme, and these I apprehend were only an index to his heart, but God was my preserver. The savage who is now my guard began to examine me about the white people, the strength of the armies going against them, etc., and boasted of their achievements in the preceding fall, at the defeat of General St. Clair. He then examined into the plunder which he had brought away from our house the day before. He found my pocketbook and money in his plunder. There were $10 in silver and half a guinea in gold in the book. During this day they gave me a piece of dry venison, about the bulk of an egg, and a piece about the same size the day we were marching, for my support and that of my child. But owing to the blows I had received from them in my jaws, I was unable to eat a bit of it. I broke it up and gave it to my child. The savage out on the lookout returned about dark. This evening, Monday the 23rd, they moved me to another station in the same valley, and secured me as they did the preceding night. Thus I found myself the second night between two Indians without fire or refreshments. During this night I was frequently asleep, notwithstanding my unpleasant situation, and as often dreamed of my arrival in Pittsburgh. Early on the morning of the 24th, a flock of mockingbirds and robins hovered over us, as we lay in our uncomfortable bed, and sung and said, at least to my imagination, that I was to get up and go off. As soon as the day broke, one of the Indians went off again to watch the trail, as on the preceding day, and he who was left to take care of me appeared to be sleeping. When I perceived this, I lay still and began to snore, as though asleep, and he fell asleep. Then I concluded it was time to escape. I found it impossible to injure him for my child at the breast, so I could not effect anything without putting the child down, and then it would cry and give the alarm. So I contented myself with taking from a pillowcase of plunder taken from our house a short gown, handkerchief, and a child's frock, and so made my escape, the sun being about half an hour high. I took a direction from home, at first being guided by the birds before mentioned, and in order to deceive the Indians then took over the hill, and struck the Conquenessing Creek, about 2 miles where I crossed it with the Indians, and went down the stream until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, over rocks, precipices, thorns, briars, etc., with my bare feet and legs. I then discovered by the sun and the running of the stream that I was on the wrong course, and going from instead of coming nearer to home. I then changed my course, ascended a hill, and sat down to rest till the sun set, and the evening star made its appearance. Then I discovered the way I should travel, and having marked out the direction I intended to take the next morning, I collected some leaves, made up a bed, and laid myself down and slept, though my feet being full of thorns began to be extremely painful, and I had nothing still to eat for myself or child. The next morning, Friday the 25th of May, about the breaking of the day, I was aroused from my slumbers by the flock of birds before mentioned, which still continued with me, and having them to guide me through the wilderness. As soon as it was sufficiently light for me to find my way, I started for the 4th day's trial, of hunger and fatigue. There was nothing very material occurred on this day while I was traveling, and I made the best of my way, according to my knowledge, toward the Allegheny River. In the evening, about the going down of the sun, a moderate rain came on, and I began to prepare for bed, by collecting some leaves together as I had done the night before. But I could not collect a sufficient quantity without setting my little boy down on the ground. But as soon as I put him out of my arms, he began to cry. Fearful of the consequence of his noise in this situation, I took him in my arms, and put him to the breast immediately, and he became quiet. I then stood and listened, and distinctly heard the footsteps of a man coming after me, in the same direction which I had come. The ground over which I had been traveling was good, and the mold was light. I had therefore left my footmarks, and thus exposed myself to a second captivity. Alarmed at my perilous situation, I looked around for a place of safety, and providentially discovered a large tree which had fallen, into the tops of which I crept with my child in my arms, and there I hid myself securely under the limbs. The darkness of the night greatly assisted me, and prevented me from detection. The footsteps I heard were those of a savage. He heard the cry of the child, and came to the very spot where the child cried. And there he halted, put down his gun, and was at this time so near that I heard the wiping stick strike against his gun distinctly. My getting in under the tree and sheltering myself from the rain, and pressing my boy to my bosom got him warm, and most providentially he fell asleep, and lay very still during the time of my danger at that time. All was still and quiet. The savage was listening if by possibility he might again hear the cry he had heard before. My own heart was the only thing I feared, and that beat so loud that I was apprehensive that it would betray me. It is almost impossible to conceive or to believe the wonderful effect my situation produced upon my whole system. After the savage had stood and listened, with nearly the stillness of death for 2 hours, the sound of a bell and a cry like that of a night owl, signals which were given to him from his savage companions, induced him to answer, and after he had given a most horrid yell, which was calculated to harrow up my soul, he started and went off to join them. After the retreat of the savage to his companions, I concluded it unsafe to remain in my concealed situation until morning, lest they should conclude upon a second search, and being favored with the light of day, find me and either tomahawk or scalp me, or otherwise bear me back to my captivity again, which was worse than death. But by this time nature was nearly exhausted, and I found some difficulty in moving from my situation that night. Yet compelled by necessity and by a love of self-preservation, I threw my coat about my child, and placed the end of it between my teeth, and with one arm and my teeth I carried the child, and with the other arm I groped my way between the trees, and travelled on, as I supposed 1 mile or 2, and there sat down at the root of a tree until morning. The night was cold and wet, and thus terminated the 4 days and nights' difficulties, trials, hunger, and danger. The 5th day, Saturday the 26th of May, wet and exhausted, hungry and wretched, I started from my resting place in the morning, as soon as I could see my way, and on that morning struck the headwaters of Pine Creek, which falls into the Allegheny about 4 miles above Pittsburgh, though I knew not then what waters they were, but I crossed them, and on the opposite bank I found a path, and discovered in it 2 moccasin tracks, fresh and dented, and the men who had made them were before me, and traveling on the same direction that I was traveling. This alarmed me, but as they were before me, and traveling in the same direction as I was, I concluded I could see them as soon as they could see me, and therefore I pressed on in that path for about 3 miles, when I came to the forks where another branch empties into it, and there was a hunter's camp where the 2 men whose tracks I had before discovered and followed had been, and kindled a fire and breakfasted, and had left the fire burning. I here became more alarmed, and came to a determination to leave the path. I then ascended a hill, and crossed a ridge towards Squaw Run, and came upon a trail or path. Here I stopped and meditated what to do, and while I was thus musing, I saw 3 deers coming toward me in full speed. They turned around to look at their pursuers. I looked too with all attention, and saw the flash of a gun, and then heard the report as soon as the gun was fired. I saw some dogs start after them, and began to look about for a shelter, and immediately made for a large log and hid myself behind it. But most providentially I did not go clear to the log. Had I done so, I might have lost my life to the bites of rattlesnakes, for as I put my hand to the ground to raise myself to see what was become of the hunters, and who they were, I saw a large heap of rattlesnakes, and the top one was very large and coiled up very near my face, and quite ready to bite me. This compelled me to leave this situation, let the consequences be what they may. In consequence of this occurrence, I again left my course, and came upon the headwaters of Squaw Run, and kept down the run the remainder of that day. During this day it rained, and I was in a very deplorable situation. So cold and shivering were my limbs, that frequently in opposition to all my struggles, I gave an involuntary groan. I suffered intensely this day from hunger, though my jaws were so far recovered from the injury they sustained from the blows of the Indians, that wherever I could, I procured some grapevines and chewed them for a little sustenance. In the evening I came within 1 mile of the Allegheny River, though I was too ignorant of it at the time, and there stood at the root of a tree. Through a most tremendous night's rain, I took up my 5th night's lodgings, and in order to shelter my infant from the storm as much as possible, I placed him in my lap, and placed my head against the tree, and thus let the rain fall down upon me. On the 6th morning of my captivity, which was the Sabbath, I found myself unable for a very considerable time to raise myself from the ground, and when I had once more by hard struggling got myself upon my feet, and started upon the 6th day's encounter, nature was so nearly exhausted, and my spirits were so completely depressed, that my progress was amazingly slow and discouraging. In this almost helpless condition, I had not gone far before I came to a path where there had been cattle traveling. I took the path under the impression that it would lead me to the abode of some white people, And by traveling it about 1 mile, I came to an uninhabited cabin, and though I was in a river bottom, yet I knew not where I was, nor yet on what river bank I had come. Here I was seized with feelings of despair, and under those feelings I went to the uninhabited cabin, and concluded that I would enter and lie down and die, as death would have been to me an angel of mercy in such a situation, and would have removed me from all my misery. Such were my feelings at this distressing moment, and had it not been for the recollection of those sufferings which my infant would endure, who would survive for some time after I was dead, I should have carried my determination into execution. Here too I heard the sound of a cowbell, which imparted a gleam of hope to my desponding mind. I followed the sound of the bell, till I came opposite to the fort at the point of the 6-mile island. When I came there I saw 3 men on the opposite bank of the river. My feelings at the sight of those were better felt than described. I called to the men, but they seemed unwilling to risk the danger of coming after me, and requested to know who I was. I replied that I was the one who had been taken prisoner by the Indians on the Allegheny River last Tuesday morning, and had made my escape from them. They requested me to walk up to the bank of the river for a while, that they may see if the Indians were making a decoy of me or not. But I replied to them that my feet were so sore that I could not walk. Then one of them, James Closier, got into a canoe to fetch me over, and the other 2 stood on the bank, with their rifles cocked ready to fire on the Indians, provided they were using me as a decoy. When Mr. Closier came near to the shore, and saw my haggard and dejected situation, he exclaimed, "Who in the name of God are you?" This man was one of my dearest neighbors before I was taken, yet in 6 days I was so much altered that he did not know me, either by my voice or my countenance. When I landed on the inhabited side of the river, the people from the fort came running out to the boat to see me. They took the child from me, and now I felt safe from danger. I found myself unable to move or to assist myself in any degree, whereupon people took me, and carried me out of the boat to the house of Mr. Cordis. Here, when I felt I was secure from the ravages and cruelties of the barbarians, for the first time since my captivity, my feelings returned with all their poignancy. When I was dragged from my bed and from my home, a prisoner with the savages, when the inhuman butchers dashed the brains of one of my dear children out on the door-sill, and afterwards scalped him before my eyes, when they took and tomahawked, scalped, and stabbed another of them before me on the island, and when, with still more barbarous feelings, they afterwards made a hoop and stretched his scalp on it, nor yet when I endured hunger, cold, and nearly nakedness, and at the same time my infant sucking my very blood to support it, I never wept. No, it was too much for nature. A tear then would have been too great a luxury, and it is more probable that tears at these seasons of distress would have been fatal in their consequences, for savages despise a tear. But now that my danger was removed, and I was delivered from the pangs of the barbarians, the tears flowed freely, and imparted a happiness beyond what I ever experienced before, or ever expect to experience in this world. When I was taken into the house, having been so long from fire, and having endured so much from hunger for a long period, the heat of the fire and the smell of the victuals, which the kindness of the people immediately induced them to provide for me, caused me to faint. Some of the people attempted to restore me, and some of them put clothes upon me. But the kindness of these friends would in all probability have killed me, had it not been for the providential arrival from down the river of Major Macaulay, who then commanded the line along the river. When he came in and saw my situation, and the provisions they were making for me, he became greatly alarmed, and immediately ordered me out of the house, from the heat and smell. He prohibited my taking anything but the whey of buttermilk, and that in very small quantities, which he administered with his own hands. Through this judicious management of my almost last situation, I was mercifully restored again to my senses, and very generally to my health and strength. 2 of the females, Sarah Carter and Mary Ann Crozier, then began to take out the thorns from my feet and legs, and Mr. Felix Nigely, who now lives at the mouth of Bull Creek, 20 miles above Pittsburgh, stood by and counted the thorns as the women took them out, and there were 150 drawn out. Though they were not all extracted at that time, For the next evening at Pittsburgh there were many more taken out. The flesh was mangled dreadfully, and the skin and flesh were hanging in pieces on my feet and legs. The wounds were not healed for a considerable time. Some of the thorns went through my feet and came out on top. For 2 weeks I was unable to put my feet to the ground to walk. Besides which, the rain to which I was exposed by night, and the heat of the sun to which my almost naked body was exposed by day, together with my carrying my child so long in my arms without any relief, and without any shelter from the heat of the day or the storms of the night, caused nearly all the skin of my body to come off, so that my body was raw nearly all over. The 2 men's tracks which I had followed down the run, referred to before, and which made me so much afraid, were 2 spies, James Amberson and John Thompson, who arrived at the station very soon after me. The news of my arrival at the station spread with great rapidity. The 2 spies took the intelligence that evening as far as Coe's Station, and the next morning to Reed's Station to my husband. It also reached Pittsburgh that same evening, and the next morning a young man who was employed by the magistrates of Pittsburgh came for me to go immediately to town, to give in my deposition, that it might be published to the American people. Being unable to walk or to ride on horseback, some of the men took me and carried me into a canoe on the river, and took me down in this manner. And when I arrived at Pittsburgh, I was taken from the canoe in the arms of the men, to the office of John Wilkins, Esquire, the father of Honorable William Wilkins, Judge of the United States Court. The deposition which I then gave in was published through the Union in the different newspapers of the day, and has since been preserved, and may be read in Loudon's Narratives of Outrages by the Indians, Volume 1, page 85. As the intelligence spread, the town of Pittsburgh and the country for 20 miles around was all in a state of commotion. About sunset the same evening my husband came to see me in Pittsburgh, and I was taken back to Coe's Station on Tuesday morning. In the evening I gave the account of the murder of my boy on the island. The next morning, Wednesday, there was a scout went out and found it by my direction, and buried it after being murdered 9 days. So that's it for this episode about the capture and escape of Massy Harbison in May of 1792. One silver lining to this episode is that Massy and her infant son were able to survive, even though her 2 older children were killed. Her infant son's name was John Harbison, and he would live until 1878, when he died in Lynn County, Iowa at the age of 87. Massy was also pregnant with another son named James Harbison at the time of her capture, and he would live until 1845. Massy would go on to have 5 more children after James, the last one born in 1815 when Massy was 45, 10 years before this publication. Massy mentioned in her narrative that 2 white men were with the band of Indians who took her. It's possible that one of these was Simon Girty, who had fought with the Indians at St. Clair's defeat the preceding fall. Massy also indicated that she dreamed of her escape and arrival in Pittsburgh, and that, as in the dream, some birds arrived to show her the path home. She said that she had no prior knowledge of the town of Pittsburgh, but later recognized areas that she had seen in her dream. This story reminded me of some other similar accounts. One example is where Josiah Wilbarger's sister, who had recently died, came to him in a dream after he had been scalped and left for dead by Comanches, and his sister told him to hold on. Sarah Hornsby, who was with the other men at Hornsby Station, then had a dream where Josiah Wilbarger was scalped and sitting next to a tree, but still alive. She roused the men at the station and they went out and found Josiah Wilbarger the next morning. So let us know what you think about Massy Harbison's story in the comments. Was this some sort of divine intervention that brought her a dream and sent some birds to show her the way to Pittsburgh? Or was this more of an embellishment added to the story? Stay tuned to this channel for the 3rd and final episode of this series, where Massy will recount some of the events that occurred after her return from captivity, including the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, where Mad Anthony Wayne would bring an end to the Northwestern Indian War. Within the next few weeks, we will also reach a major milestone on this channel. We are going to release a video with our first illustrations completed by a human artist, specifically for this channel. Lots of our videos have included AI-generated art, and some viewers have criticized this, so don't miss our upcoming episode that will include original art created in the old-fashioned way, and designed specifically for this channel. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been labeled unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. But here on this channel we keep our worthy history alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to help keep actual history alive, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. For $5, you will have access to our members-only videos. One of these videos we released several months ago included a shorter story of Massy Harbison's escape that was printed in Incidents of Border Life in 1838. In addition to access to these videos, your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.